Vice President Jourova and Commissioner Dalli also presented the Gender Equality Strategy, which they will present in detail to you tomorrow here in this press room. The College also decided to register a European Citizens Initiative entitled Voters Without Borders, Full Political Rights for EU Citizens. You can find more information in a press release online. Furthermore, Commissioner Kyriakides gave us an overview of the state of play of the coronavirus or COVID-19 outbreak and the current and future steps taken by the Member States with the support of the European Union. As you know, the Commission has set up a new website which continuously provides day-to-day information and updates for citizens. So, back to the climate law we've adopted this morning. I'm sure you have all heard what President von der Leyen had just now to say about this, and I have very little to add. I think this law is about showing that the EU means business when we pledge to make Europe climate neutral by 2050. It will help us to stay the course amidst the many other urgencies that will come our way in the next 30 years. So it will allow institutions, when there is another crisis, to focus on that, as we need to do now on the refugee crisis or the COVID crisis. But at the same time, it will make sure we stay on track to reach climate neutrality by 2050. And it is also something that entrepreneurs and investors have been asking for. Give us some clarity, give us a clear course that you will stick to so that we know where we need to invest and that we know where to avoid stranded assets, etc. And of course, it is a clarion call to our partners worldwide to join us in this journey. You know, we pledged to be the first climate neutral continent by 2050, but at the same time, it's also an open challenge to others. Try and beat us. This is sort of a race I like to be in, and everybody wins. The proposal for a European climate law sets the goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050, a goal that was established by the European Council with full support of the European Parliament. In other words, we will continue on our path of reducing emissions as far as possible, and we will balance any outstanding emissions with new carbon sinks and storage. Of course, many people are keen, as I've seen everywhere, to hear the Commission's 2030 targets. To those, I say that our work to assess the impact of the new 2030 target has started and is ongoing. And as you know, we want to find out what the best landing zone is if we want to get to from 50% towards 55% emissions cuts in 2030. To do that will require huge efforts by all, and that is why we don't want to make thoroughness and detail the victim of political expediency. I'm absolutely convinced if the Commission were to today announce a figure that has not been fully assessed for impact, then we would have an endless discussion over many months whether the Commission is right, whether this is whether the assumptions are correct, whether the facts are correct, etc. And we would lose a lot of time. So to those who say, when you come at the end of the summer with your number, you've lost time, I would say, with my experience, for instance, with the plastic strategy, if you do an impact assessment so that the facts are no longer disputed, you can move quicker also in the legislative process. So once we've done this work, we will propose an amendment to the climate law that we are presenting today, and we will put the 2030 target in there as well. In addition, we're also proposing to set the path for emissions reductions from 2030 to 2050 based on the best available science. So the European climate law will set all the targets we need, but of course it also requires tools to make sure we're hitting these targets. We will build on the existing governance mechanisms for the Energy Union and link our work with a 5-yearly global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. Where we see that collective action or national action is not in line with the trajectory we've set, then we will make the necessary proposals to correct that. First of all, from 2030 on, we will monitor our progress every 5 years, and if we find we're off track, we will adjust the trajectory. To be sure, there are not many different lines between 2030 and 2050 one can draw. At the end of the day, it's about hitting climate neutrality in 2050. And to be perfectly honest with you, I remember very well my experience with the Lisbon strategy. If you have a strategy but you want it to succeed, you have to be clear about the intermediary steps you take to get there. Otherwise, the strategy remains a thing of words and ambitions, but not of concrete results. So, what sort of proposals could we then make if it is necessary to correct the course? That could be proposals for additional and stronger binding EU action. For instance, with regard to the ETS system, the Renewable Energy Directive, and CO2 emissions performance standards for cars and vans, LULUCF as we call it, land use and land use change regulation, or the Energy Efficiency Directive. And to make one thing perfectly clear, we will make those proposals, and this will be done according to the existing legislative rules with full powers of the co-legislators, Parliament and Council. That doesn't change. They remain in charge of legislation. The decision on legislation, we remain in charge of the proposals. So it could also be that we make recommendations to Member States for national measures. Let me say a few words about adaptation. Whatever we achieve in the next 5 years, and indeed in the next 30 years, we will still have to prepare to face the impacts of our changing climate. You know, the time has come and gone where we could say, let's not talk about adaptation because that's sort of almost like admitting defeat. Adaptation is an essential element of our strategy, and I've just come back from Africa, and it is very clear that adaptation measures are urgently needed, and that we will also have to take our international responsibility to help African countries do that. But also increasingly in Europe, especially in the Mediterranean area, we see that adaptation is more and more important. Floods in one corner of Europe, droughts in another corner, forest fires, wildfires, crop failures. We need to adapt to a situation that is already changing. The European climate law will also require Member States to enhance their adaptive capacity and strengthen their resilience and our collective resilience. So we will follow this up with a new EU adaptation strategy, which will come out later this year. The final thing I want to touch on today is action by citizens and by civil society. We want to launch a European climate pact to help harness and channel everyone's efforts to change the way we produce, consume, use and reuse and discard. The big and small pledges that we take every day, to ourselves, to our loved ones, to our friends, to our neighbours, colleagues, or employers and employees. We see this also in the Commission. Our commitment to be climate neutral by 2030 has direct consequences for everyone in this institution, and we're seeing this every day when we're mapping out what needs to be done. So we want to collect all the knowledge that's out there. We want to share it, and we want to inspire each other to step out of a carbon-fueled world towards a decarbonised world that is healthier, cleaner, safer and more sustainable. And we will leave no one behind. So we were inspired by grassroots movements, as you know. This morning, President von der Leyen had invited Greta Thunberg to assist at the beginning of the college meeting and to share her view with us. And as I said to her this morning, I'm sure that without the movement she has inspired and is leading, probably today we would not have a Green Deal. And probably today I would not be talking about something that is quite unique and quite forward-looking, this climate law. I've listened carefully to Greta, and the message I take away from her words is this planet doesn't belong to those in power or the generations in power. It belongs to the whole of humanity. And I feel a strong responsibility. I have kids in her generation. I'm fortunate enough to have kids in the millennial generation and in the Generation Z, and I feel strong responsibility that together with them we should make sure we make a success of European climate neutrality by 2050. And as I could repeat time and time again, when people are saying this is about saving the planet, no, it's not. The planet can take care of itself. And if we're too much of a nuisance, the planet will get rid of us like the planet got rid of other species before. This is about saving humanity. This is about creating the right conditions so that humanity can live in balance with its natural environments in a way that is equitable and in a way that does not say to those in the world who aspire to our level of life, who aspire to live like us, to say to them, no, that's not possible because Mother Earth could not afford that. Yes, she can. If we adapt, if we do this, if we stick to this road, then we can reach this. This is a problem that is huge, it is existential, but it's also a problem that can be fixed. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll now have time to take a few questions. I'll start with Marine here in the front.
Hello, Mehreen Khan from the Financial Times. I have two questions. Given the sensitivities around the 2030 target and the lot of criticism that you've come up with, I'm wondering why you chose then to also apply interim targets every 5 years using a delegated act. I mean, this is hugely politically sensitive, and I mean, some could say this is just like waving the red rag in front of the bull that is the member states who don't like this. And secondly, it's not clear in the draft and also your comments that what exactly will happen to a member state that is not abiding by the targets or the trajectory set out in the climate law. We know that the Commission has tools like infringement procedures or possible use of the semester. Can you tell us actually what you think? And if you don't yet know, when will we know what you're thinking?
I don't think it's such a big deal what instrument we use. And if that's going to be the discussion, I'm happy to talk about that till kingdom come. The thing is, we're talking about the period 2030-2050. So the first time the Commission might have to use an instrument to correct our path will be in 2035. So I wonder what everybody's so terribly excited about. If by then we might have other instruments, or if they need other instruments. But somebody's got to be the tom-tom in this. Somebody's got to be our sat-nav in this. Somebody's got to tell us at some point whether we're still on track or not. And I think the Commission is best placed to do this. This is what we're now doing also with our impact assessment on 2030. The impact assessment will help us to say where we need to be in 2030, whether it's minus 50 or up to minus 55 vis-à-vis 1990, and we do this on impact assessment. And I think that we should be doing this starting in 2035 exactly the same way, see where we go, and then, if necessary, adapt that. And we think that is best done by the Commission. If others feel they're better placed to do that, fine. But I think this is the most rational thing to do. So it's only about determining the trajectory. It's not about the legislation that will be needed to correct that. There the Commission can make proposals, and the co-legislators retain full power to decide whether we do it or not. Now, your second question, what do you do with member states that don't comply? Well, the thing is, the commitment to be climate neutral by 2050 is undertaken by the member states. So I think it's only just that we sort of remind them of their own commitments and try to keep them on that track. Should it be through punitive measures? I think political pressure is going to be much more effective here. But then again, I'm confident that these, for instance, the ones I mentioned, these legislative measures, where we decide by qualified majority, could help us bring this forward. The Commission will make a proposal, and then by qualified majority, Parliament and Council will decide. That's a community method that will apply here, and that will not change. The only thing that the Commission proposes is to set the trajectory by an act that the Commission could do on itself. If there are better ways of doing that, I'm completely open to discussing it. But if that is the main issue here today, then I'm happy. Then apparently all the other issues are fully embraced by members of the European Parliament and others.
Okay, I have Sam from Euractiv down in front.
It's green, no pun intended.
New policy.
Even better.
Thanks, Tim. So on the 2030 target, you've been asked by 12 member states to bring forward the deadline of the impact assessment from September to June. But as your impact assessment will take into account the NECPs, and 3 of those 12 countries are yet to submit them, are you now going to tell them to do their homework in time? Is that being a bit hypocritical? And then on the 2050 target, the climate law says that you won't be doing an impact assessment because the existing work from 2018 is sufficient. Does that risk saying a sort of mixed signals about whether an impact assessment is the best course of action? Thanks.
The letter of the 12 member states asks us to do it quickly but also thoroughly. Yeah, that's the whole point. If I put quite a lot of pressure on our services to be as quick as they can, but if they tell me, if you want it to be thorough and if you want it to be correct, we will need until at the end of the summer to do this, I have to respect this. I have to respect this. I choose this above the possibly politically more attractive option of now putting it immediately into. I would have loved to be able to do that, or even before the summer. But if our experts say that in good conscience they cannot deliver that before the end of the summer or the middle of September, I will respect that. And by the way, thank you for pointing out that we're still waiting for some of those member states to do their own homework. And I sort of could respond in the same way you just did, and say, well, do your homework, and then your plea will be slightly more credible. On the second point, look, it's relatively, although complicated, but still it's feasible to be very good on impact assessment for 2030. But then if you move beyond that, you know, we're talking about 15 years from now, 20 years from now, 25, 30 years from now, you have to use the best available science when you reach that point to be able to say what is exactly necessary. And of course we will then also, if we need to change the trajectory, we will use impact assessment to do it at that time, obviously, with the best available science we will have at that time. But let me also, for those who might be fearful that the Commission would be too much in charge in all of this, if we reach, let's say for argument's sake, we put -55 into the legislation in September and we reach that in 2030, then the 20 years that come, to go from -55 to 0 is pretty straightforward. You don't have a huge space to maneuver. The trajectory will be pretty straightforward. So the corrections, I assume, would be rather minimal, and that's why we propose this relatively light instrument to do that. But again, if by that time co-legislators feel we should use other instruments, that's not the thing that's going to keep me awake at night. What's keeping me awake at night if we don't just steer off the course to reach the target in 2050.
Okay, there's a lot of hands up. We'll try and get to as many as we can. I'll take the FD here in the front.
Hi, I have two questions as well. The first one is, why took the college meeting an hour longer than planned? Does it have anything to do with the climate law? And the second one is, Greta Thunberg just called the climate law a surrender, actually. Why is she wrong?
First of all, the meeting took long because we had quite a number of issues on the table today, and the one that was dealt with most expediently was the climate law, because there was a large consensus around the table, so that didn't take that long. But we have other issues on the table in Europe, and those were the reason why it took longer than anticipated. Greta Thunberg, she explained this morning that her approach to the issue is based on sort of the carbon budget approach, which is a different approach than the one we choose. And when you go out from the carbon budget approach and then the most cautious approach, or assuming that there will be a number of disappointments, and in her view, a number of technologies that will not be able to deliver what we supposedly deliver, then the target should be much higher for both 2030 and 2050. That is her analysis, and I think there are a number of NGOs out there who agree with her on that. I tried to explain to her that our approach is different, and that our approach is based on us reaching carbon neutrality by 2050, and secondly, that we are more optimistic than she is about emerging technologies that could help us speed up the process. So that is where we essentially have a different point of view. But I think these different points of view, and whatever is being said right now, don't take away the fact that without her and without the way she mobilized 2 generations of young people across the world, we probably would not be discussing a European climate law today.
Okay, we have Anna.
Anna Sujewska, Polish Daily Rzeczpospolita. In December, the European Council, there was a sentence in the conclusions, one member state at this stage cannot commit to implement this objective as far as it is concerned. I'm just wondering where exactly in the draft regulation this sentence is reflected, if anywhere. And my second question is, in the draft regulation, there is all the time the phrase collective effort or collective action by member states. So does it mean that in 2050 there could be different levels for different member states, or does it mean that each member state individually has to be climate neutral by 2050? Thank you.
Collective effort means that every member state commits to being climate neutral by 2050. That is the answer to your second question. The answer to your first question, there is a clear reference in the draft regulation to the conclusions of the European Council, and that refers to also the conclusion you have mentioned explicitly.
Okay, Catherine in the middle.
Catherine Fiore, EU reporter. You said that it's a race. I'm just wondering if it's going to be a race with a level playing field, favourite expression of the European Commission. The EU is looking at supporting its own countries with a Just Transition Fund, but we also have neighbouring countries, and Ursula von der Leyen mentioned before this press conference that the EU is looking at a carbon border tax. So are we taking an approach where we will assist EU countries and have an incentive scheme, whereas we are going to take a punitive approach to those outside the EU?
Well, it's an interesting point. I also discussed it yesterday in a teleconference with a Chinese representative because there are many questions about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, as we like to call it. The thing is this. We will be asking European industry to make huge investments to assure that we are carbon neutral, climate neutral by 2050. If at the same time we do not address the potential issue of carbon leakage, then you don't get to higher goals and you weaken the competitive edge of European industry. So, as I've said to my Chinese colleague and to others, the best way to avoid a carbon border adjustment mechanism is to make sure you go in the same way, that you also take measures that take you to conformity with the Paris agreements. If that is done, then there will be no necessity for a carbon border tax. But if it isn't done, I think we are absolutely right and absolutely in conformity with international rules to protect European industry if we do take those measures, and then a carbon border tax might be the instrument. There might be other instruments. You could look at ETS and other instruments, but we will protect European industry if it takes the historic step of decarbonising in the next generation.
Okay, I'll come to Oliver here.
Hi, over here, Oliver Kim with the Austrian newspaper Die Presse. What was Ms. Thunberg's response to your intervention? Because judging from what she's currently saying in the European Parliament, you didn't seem to make much of an impression on her. And then secondly, closer to home, does the Commission intend to walk the talk in terms of climate neutrality? If you enter any Commission building, it's very rare that you see an energy efficiency label above D or C. So basically, if you want to reach climate neutrality in 30 years' time, you actually need to completely redo all your office stock, which is going to be very, very costly, and you don't have very spendthrift member states financing that. And on top of that, a final question, does the Commission intend not to take the plane anymore to go to Strasbourg when you have your college meetings there, but to actually take the train as everyone else does, and as probably Ms. Thunberg would also advise you to do?
Anything else on the sunny side of things? Well, as I said, I gave my point of view to Greta Thunberg this morning, and apparently she doesn't agree. That's fine. We're all striving to achieve the same goal. She has more ambition, apparently, or she doesn't think that we can deliver, but I think we can. And there we just disagree, and not a problem at all. On your second point, we've committed, not in 30 years, in 20 years, to be climate neutral as an institution. So in 2030, this institution will be climate neutral. And we're now discovering that that is a huge, huge challenge. Indeed, because we travel, because we have many buildings, etc. We're all over the world. And we're now doing the mapping. And this is something, that's why I referred to it earlier in my introduction. This is something that you talk about with your colleagues all the time. This is something you talk about with those responsible for the buildings. This is something myself, I try to find out what the best way is to reduce our carbon footprint when we need to travel to Strasbourg. I've looked very intensively at our car park, how we can make sure that there we also reduce our carbon footprint. So no misunderstanding. This is going to be a Herculean effort to get there. And yes, we're under budget constraints, but we've made that commitment, and we want to show to the rest of the world that we can do that. And now, speaking, I've forgotten your third question, so I would ask you to. The flights. Yeah, no, I've answered your third question. We're looking at a way to reduce to the maximum the carbon footprint also in our travels, also to Strasbourg. And I've noticed that quite a number of colleagues, for instance, I don't travel by plane, I travel by car, but I make sure the car is full so that we use the car to the maximum effect. Then we have to look at what sort of car we use. Then we have to look whether the trains provide the solutions we have, because sometimes we have to travel very early or very late, whether that's possible. But we're all looking into that. And we will make sure that we as an institution from the highest level, because you have to lead by example, we show that this can be done. Yeah, follow us and see how we do it, and stay critical if you think we're not doing well enough.
Okay. We do have another press conference to follow, so I'm just going to take two more, the lady on the side and then here in the middle. Sorry to everybody else, not today.
Bonjour, Anna Hubert pour Contexte. J'avais une question. Dans une version précédente du texte qui avait circulé, on évoquait un objectif pour l'après 2050, éventuellement de réduire, non seulement d'aller au-delà de la simple neutralité, de réduire, d'absorber toutes les émissions de carbone, et elle n'apparaît pas dans la version finale du texte. Je voulais savoir ce qui s'était passé. Merci.
Il y a plein de choses qui n'apparaissent plus, qui étaient dans des textes précédents. C'est pour ça qu'il vaut mieux ne pas lire des textes qui ne sont pas des textes officiels. Ça mène toujours à des confusions. J'ai l'expérience après 6 années, et je vois je vous vois et je vois pas mal de collègues ici qui ont le génie de toujours trouver des textes qui ne sont pas encore mûrs dans les bureaux de la Commission. Mais il est clair, même si ce n'est pas dans le texte, si on veut vraiment atteindre le but qu'on est en train d'atteindre, qu'on veut atteindre, il faudra aussi penser à l'après 2050. Ça sera pour un autre jour, mais l'après 2050, ça veut dire qu'il faudra avoir une contribution positive, c'est-à-dire des émissions négatives, pour assurer que le monde le plus développé prenne sa responsabilité vis-à-vis du monde qui a encore une trajectoire énorme à faire pour devenir développé comme nous le sommes.
And then last question in the middle. Sorry to everyone.
Yes, Frédéric Simon from Euractiv. Oh. Okay. It's about the social aspects of the transition to net zero. There have been a number of concerns that have been raised, particularly in countries like Poland, but also in Romania, Bulgaria, and also by trade unions, that the size of the just transition mechanism is not sufficient to deal with the scale of the problem from a social policy perspective. So what can you say to those people today? Can you give them guarantees that actually no one will be left behind?
Our commitment is that no one will be left behind. Our commitment is to use the Just Transition Fund and Just Transition Mechanism to make sure that in those areas that are most vulnerable in this transition we support. But we will have to reorient most, if not all, the instruments we use in Europe towards this incredible transition. This is tectonic. This is not just a small change. This is tectonic transition to make sure that we leave no one behind. Let me add one thing to this. Who do you think would suffer most if we did not do this? Who do you think would suffer most if we just had this line of, well, let's go on like we are, let's pretend there's no problem, let's pretend there's no industrial revolution going on, let's pretend we can go on coal mining for another 50 years. Who will suffer most? Who will suffer most if the temperature rises above 2 degrees and then we reach a number of tipping points that will create problems in the world that we can no longer manage or control? Who will suffer most? The people who can't go anywhere else. Rich people can find other places. They can go high up in the mountains or in places that are not. But poor people, or people who are struggling with their jobs, they can't go anywhere. And if the areas they live in are highly affected because we are too slow in making sure we limit the rise of temperature, it's the poor people, it's the working people that will pay the highest price. So yes, we will make sure that our policies make the transition fair and that we leave no one behind. But let's also be clear about the cost of non-action. So if you think avoiding a transition is possible by not doing anything, you are really, really mistaken. And Mother Nature is reminding us of this on a daily basis.
So really the last question this time.
Bonjour, merci. Marine Laouché de l'agence France Presse. Je voulais juste revenir brièvement sur le calendrier. Certains estiment que si la Commission ne propose un nouvel objectif pour 2030 qu'à la rentrée en septembre, ça sera un peu juste pour arriver avec une ambition relevée à la COP 26 à Glasgow. Est-ce que vous estimez que c'est possible avec un tel calendrier? Merci.
Oui, je crois que c'est possible, mais ça dépendra aussi du Parlement européen et du Conseil et des États membres. Je crois que c'est possible. Mais de là dire, c'est mieux d'avancer maintenant sans avoir étudié l'impact en précision. Je crois qu'on aura un débat pendant des mois de ceux qui disent la Commission n'a pas fait son devoir, on dispute les chiffres qu'elle utilise, etc., etc. Donc on ne gagnerait pas de temps en mettant des chiffres que peut-être, comme l'a fait le Parlement européen, a ses raisons, mais n'est pas complètement contrôlé en ce qui concerne l'impact. Donc je préfère être sûr, je préfère ne pas avoir un débat sur les faits et d'avoir un débat sur les choix politiques. Et on peut faire ça au mois de septembre. Si on fait ça au mois de septembre, je suis convaincu qu'on sera bien préparé pour la COP de Glasgow.
Okay, thank you very much, Executive Vice President. And as you've probably found already, all the press materials are online, so there's some extra reading for you as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.